Sat down and realized that I looked really nerdy today, which I guess is fitting for this video. Hello! Welcome back to my web series. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the classes that I took while I was abroad and talk about the books that I read, how it was different from the classes that I take at GW, which is my home university, and just tell you a little bit more about how I like them. So, as I said in my introduction video, I am a double major in English and Women's Studies, and also a classics minor. I didn't take classes that had anything to do with the classics minor while I was abroad, but I did take classes that fulfilled requirements for both Women's Studies and for English. For English classes, I took two literature classes. One was contemporary literature and one was African languages and literatures 2. In the first one, which was contemporary literature, as I just said, we read 5 books, which were Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov, Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, Lucy by Jamaica Kincaid, By the Sea by Abdul Razak Gurnah, and The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon. These were all books that I had heard of and known about at my university. They're well known in American literature, Western literature, so it was interesting to be in Cape Town and be taking these classes at a university that was non-Western, even though I would have liked to read maybe more contemporary South African literature. It was interesting to take the class and see how South African university curriculums structured classes around these books and these novels and how they analyzed them. In addition to the classes that we took, the lecture classes, we also took smaller seminar sections. So it was about, could be up to 20 people, whereas the lectures were very big. They could be about 200 or 300 people. I took a contemporary literature seminar that was about post-colonial crime fiction, which was very new to me. I'd never taken a crime fiction class at all. And I really wanted to delve more into a genre that I was not as familiar with, especially through the lens of post-colonial literature as a whole. In that class, we read books by Kazuo Ishiguro. There was one book named Red Dust by Gillian Slovo that was about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which existed after apartheid was over. And that was very interesting because I was the only American person in that class. It was very small. There were about 7 people in my section. And to be in a class where you're the only foreign student, especially the only American foreign student, is very eye-opening because they didn't cater at all to anything that I wouldn't know if I wasn't South African. So they would kind of just talk about the TRC as if I knew everything about it, and at first I didn't know anything about it. So I kind of had to come to class prepared to know all of these little background details and elements so I could engage in the discussion, and I really enjoyed that because it pushed me and it challenged me to consider myself a part of this class, not just as an exchange student, and it made me learn a lot more about what I was reading and the place that I was in, just the classroom, the university, and the country and city as a whole. And the way that these lectures worked, a little bit different from the lectures that I was used to, because in the US, at least at my university, and I know at a lot of other major universities, they have one professor for the class, 1 or 2 professors, and then maybe a TA and some discussion sections that they facilitate. But in Cape Town, at the University of Cape Town, they had a few lecturers for these English classes. So we had a different lecturer for each novel, or one professor would do a few novels, but it wasn't all the same person all the way through. So I think that definitely kept it fresh. And it was interesting to see all the different perspectives that each professor gave, especially since they were teaching on completely different material in terms of the novels that we were reading. For my African literature class, we also read 5 books. Forgive me if I am butchering these names in any way. Hopefully after a semester of studying them, I'm not, because I've been hearing it a lot. But we read The Palm Wine Drinker by Amos Tutuola, The Joys of Motherhood by Buchi Emecheta, Devil on the Cross by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born by Ayikwe Ama, and The Icarus Girl by Helen Oyeyemi. And then in my seminar, which was about, it was called Writing Across Worlds, Translocal Texts. and it kind of focused on existing in different atmospheres in terms of culture and then place. So if you were in a place that didn't like quite represent you, whether that was because you were an immigrant or you spoke a different language. In that seminar, we actually read one of my favorite books of the whole semester, and it was by a Zimbabwean author whose name was No Violet Bulawayo, and the book was called We Need New Names, and it was written from the perspective of a child, so the language was a lot more colloquial than novels like Lolita or Invisible Man or even Devil on the Cross and these other books. But I really enjoyed it because it was definitely a fresh perspective, a style that I was not familiar with, and it had a lot of commentary that I think resonated with a lot of the students in my class, whether they were from Zimbabwe or they were just from Cape Town or other places in South Africa, and had a lot to do with the trope of displacement, and talked a lot also about poverty because the main character is living in this like very poverty-struck area and has these dreams of traveling to these grand places. So it touches a lot on themes that are very heavy and deep, but in this way, from the perspective of a child, that is very intriguing and grabbing and unique. So that's why I really enjoyed that novel. I definitely think that classes like that sometimes encourage conversation because they ask questions, the professors will ask questions, general questions that they'll just kind of open up to the floor. And it pushed me to kind of know enough to be able to raise my hand and answer the questions, but it was also interesting because there were a lot of exchange students in the bigger class, the lecture for African literature, whether they were from America, some of them were from Europe, studying for just the semester, and then a lot of other just South African white students. So it was an interesting dynamic because I wanted to exist respectfully in the space and kind of learn and not really insert myself into spaces that were not mine in terms of trying to analyze texts in a way that would suggest I knew exactly what it was talking about, especially since these books by Amos Tutuola and like Aikwe, they're just not read in the US. Like I had never heard those names in a US classroom before. They kind of just existed as a distant trope. I hope in the future that it will change, but I didn't want to seem like I was coming in and telling everybody what I thought I knew as this American student, trying to like insert my knowledge into this classroom. For gender studies, I took one gender studies class, so I took 3 classes total, including the other 2 English classes, and the gender studies class I took was race, class, and gender. In this class we also had a discussion section, but it was focused all on the material that we read in class, so it wasn't like the seminars where we read other books. We focused on all the readings that we focused on in lecture, and we only had 2 professors for the lecture, so it didn't alternate as much as the English classes did. And I really, really loved the first lecturer. I had actually read her work for a previous class that I had taken at GW, so when I came to UCT, I was very excited and kind of starstruck that I was going to be able to take a class with this professor. Her name was Amrita Pandey. She does work on female surrogacy in India, and you should definitely check it out. This class, it was definitely eye-opening as well, but for a lot of different reasons, because I had read some of the readings we had done before, Judith Butler, Audre Lorde, some of those names I've been familiar with. And then we also did some readings on South Africa specifically, whether it was news articles or just theorists who existed in the South African atmosphere of gender studies. My favorite unit of the class was the unit on masculinity, which sounds kind of funny if you don't know a lot about how gender studies is structured, but we read a lot about the effect of sexism on masculinity, especially in the South African world. There's so many different examples of different kinds of masculinity in terms of race and class, just all of these social factors like the Nelson Mandela model of masculinity versus the current president Jacob Zuma's model of masculinity, and then hegemonic white versions of masculinity as well. And that was all new to me. I'd never learned about that or considered that, and it definitely made me think about how that's structured in other places of the world, especially in the US where I primarily had been living. And in that class as well, we learned a lot and read a lot about a concept called symbolic violence, which is basically the threat of violence, of physical violence that has existed because of its legacy. So because of slavery and apartheid that have exhibited real physical violence, now exists this phenomenon of symbolic violence that can manifest itself in ways like lack of opportunity and racism, all of these symbolic factors that are very ingrained in society, especially in South Africa, but also in other places of the world, that often just go completely unnoticed or unacknowledged because there's this myth that now that apartheid has ended, or we live in this post-racial society and everything, is equal, which is just not true. I actually ended up writing my final paper for that class on symbolic violence. I used a lot of Steve Biko, Audre Lorde, Frantz Fanon, all authors that if you haven't read should definitely check out. Their work is so universal and applicable to societies that are dealing with this problem of post-racial society that is not really taking effect the way people think it is taking effect. It's really important to read this and realize that it's not just talking about the place in which that author is existing. Audre Lorde can write in the US, but it can still be applicable to so many other places in the world. Frantz Fanon can write from France, but people in the US or South Africa can still relate to those experiences, no matter when they were written or where they were written. This class also had a lot of American students, a lot of both American and other foreign exchange students. So more than the other classes, I would say definitely I learned when to speak, when it was okay to speak, when it was time to kind of let people who were from Cape Town and from South Africa, who had been living in this atmosphere, talk about their experiences and how it related to the readings, and give them that safe space to reflect and not overtake. I would say that the gender studies class was definitely my favorite class. I learned so much, and even if we were reading things that I had already read before, I was looking at it from this intensely different perspective, and that was really something that I was looking forward to when I was going to Cape Town, because I wanted to encounter things that I'd seen before, but see it from a completely different perspective, and I definitely reached that goal better than I ever could have expected. So that class was definitely my favorite. In terms of using all of this after I came back, it definitely influenced the way I thought when I got back to GW. I've used so many of the readings that I read in Cape Town in papers, or just like my responses in discussions for my classes at GW, and it has really opened my eyes into this world of scholarship that often goes ignored because it's not westernized and it doesn't talk about American powers or Western powers, and it's definitely influenced me to use it in further studies like a thesis or other like graduate studies. Definitely something that I'm considering. In addition to those classes I took for credit at my university, I also took a not-for-credit beginners OSA class, which I talked about a little bit in the tag video. It was really interesting because I hadn't taken a language in so long, especially not a language that wasn't a Romance language. So it was very difficult for me, but definitely rewarding, even though I just learned things like how to say my name and how to ask people how are you, or how old are you and where are you from. I did keep all my notebooks and the CDs I have from that class because it's a memory of the privilege that I had of learning at least a little bit of another language. in a country that has 11 national languages. Especially since English is so widely spoken, so a lot of times you can forget that any other language is spoken there, especially if you're an American exchange student. So I'm very glad that I did that. So I hope you enjoyed this video and that it was informative about my learning experiences in terms of academics in Cape Town, and I will see you next time.